But thanks so much, everyone, for joining us here today. I'd firstly like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose land we're meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And a huge thank you to ANU's Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions and the Institute of Water Futures for hosting both UNICEF Australia and Deloitte Access Economics here today. We're really grateful to be contributing to the 2025 Disaster Solutions Update. And it gives me great pleasure to launch formally our report today in partnership with Deloitte, the social and economic impacts of disasters on children and young people. We encourage you to read further, and out the front of the lecture theatre, there are cards with QR codes, as well as our policy paper with recommendations. So please grab one on your way out. And the social and economic impacts of disasters on children and young people is the second report in a series that we've partnered with Deloitte on. And both reports really serve to highlight both the moral imperative to act and also the economic consequences that disasters will have upon children in Australia. The report projects that these costs could grow up to $100 billion under different warming scenarios through to 2060. So pretty big numbers that we're talking about. And not only are these impacts costly, but the social and economic consequences for children, for young people, for our future are distinct and they are long lasting. So we'll unpack these findings in a bit more detail during our panel. But first of all, I'd like to introduce you to UNICEF Australia's young ambassador, Lincoln Ingravalle, who's joining us online. Lincoln witnessed firsthand the devastation of the Black Summer bushfires in Gippsland, and he is a passionate advocate for young people who are at the coalface of climate change, and he's working to amplify their voices to shape both policy and resilience. So welcome, Lincoln.
Thank you, Katie. I'm honoured to be joining you today from Melbourne, and let me begin by commending the dialogue from across this morning's panels. As we turn our attention to the economic and social impacts of disasters on children and young people, I want to begin this session by sharing some of my personal experience before I hand over to the panel to present some truly trailblazing research. Behind the powerful words and data compiled by UNICEF Australia and Deloitte Access Economics in the report launched here today, there are stories, young stories that reveal the humanity behind the research, the headlines, and the disasters that capture our attention. When I consider my own story, I am proud to have been afforded so many opportunities that only a country like Australia can provide. Born and raised in Gippsland, Victoria, I grew up with mountains, bush, a glistening coastline and rich farmland all in my backyard. But with profound natural wonder comes profound risk. In my lifetime, I've seen fires, floods, droughts and storms decimate my region time and again. In 2009, at a family celebration, I smelt bushfire smoke for the first time. Black Saturday was a once-in-a-generation fire that took 173 lives and over 1,800 homes, many in my community. In 2019, the term once in a generation will be called into question. I was on the coast holidaying and celebrating the end of year 12 and the promise of the future. But as the skies blackened and the air smelt more like smoke than celebration, concerned messages from parents rolled in. The music was a little less loud and the Vic Emergency app a little more present. As Black Summer, as we would come to know it, raged on, we were told we could not leave Lake's entrance. Staying put was the safest option. Yet safe was the opposite of how I felt. And for good reason. We watched the Royal Australian Navy rescue the population of Marlow, some of them friends, and saw endless aerial footage of destroyed homes, lost lives, and decimated communities. For me, and for many children and young people in my region, Black Summer is responsible for a variety of lifelong consequences. Growing up with the Latrobe Valley's coal-fired power stations in the foreground, climate change has always been real, lived, and taking its toll. An industry that once gave prosperity to our region is destined to take it away. Unless we as a nation do more to safeguard Gippsland and regions like its future and mitigate the damage to its children and young people. This nexus of fates, of great natural landscapes, the growing frequency and severity of disasters, and the much needed energy transition requires us to ask, what are the costs to children and young people? What are the costs to their future? It's the missed days of school. It's the smoke inhaled by young lungs, the lifelong anxiety every summer as the mercury soars towards 40 degrees. It is health, education, income, hope, and prosperity. The dollar value is real, the human stories are real, and the damage is being done today. I commend this report and challenge us all to ensure that dust not be allowed to settle on its cover until we forge a better path forward, one that safeguards the rights of the child in the face of this climate crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lincoln, for that powerful reflection and call to action. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nishadh Rego. I'm the head of climate at UNICEF Australia, and I lead our portfolio of climate work across policy and advocacy programs and child and youth engagement. It's great to be back here again. I have many memories of this room from back in the day. I'm doing undergraduate economics. Not all of them are great, but it is excellent to be back here and in good company. I just want to start by underscoring some of what Katie has said. The findings of this report make for quite sobering reading. The headline finding, as we'll discuss in more detail, is that disasters impose a $6.3 billion measurable economic, social cost on children and young people in an average year. And these costs come from impacts impacts on the things that I think are most meaningful to all of us as human beings: learning, employment, healthcare, and safety. And as we've heard already this morning, the Australian government is about to release its nationally determined contributions, its national climate risk assessment, and its national adaptation plan. And in that context, I think this report offers yet another stark warning. If we are not ambitious about limiting global warming, climate-related disasters will become even more severe and frequent than we are able to predict. The impacts will worsen, the costs will increase, and the consequences will be devastating for our children and our young people, for our economy, and for societal resilience as a whole. We have a wonderful panel here today to unpack this report in much greater detail. Farthest from me is Associate Professor Rosalind Prinsley, who you heard from this morning, but I will introduce again for those who are just joining us. Rosalind Prinsley is the lead disaster solutions in the School of Engineering, College of Systems and Society at ANU. She was previously head of disaster solutions at ISADS. She was head of strategic research initiatives in the Office of the ANU Deputy Vice Chancellor Research. And prior to that, she was National Advisor for Science and Mathematics Education and Industry in the Office of the Chief Scientist. And Rosalind has an extensive career in research with over 110 publications. In the middle, we have David Rumbens, who is a partner with Deloitte Access Economics. He has extensive experience with Australia's preeminent economic consulting firm, including in social and economic impact analysis and public policy, and he led the team that produced the report we're launching today. And finally, we have Katie Maskiell, who you know is our head of policy and advocacy at UNICEF Australia and leads our advocacy on a range of child rights issues in Australia and internationally. So first to you, David. As I've said, one of the headline findings of the report is that the economic and social impacts of disasters on children and young people amount to $6.3 billion in a typical year, which is equivalent to about 6,782 per affected person. So I want to ask who actually bears these costs? Is it individuals, society, government, and how are they actually broken down?
Thanks, Nish, and hi everyone. Great to be here today. Look, there's quite a dimension of cost, and we can think of it over a time spectrum. So those costs that are borne around the time of the event or shortly after the event. So displacement from housing, there's costs associated with that. Young people who can't go to work, and so they have foregone earnings. The cost of some injuries that as a result of the disaster of the event. Those costs are borne at the time and are significant, but they're actually shaded by the costs that come over time afterwards. And so here we can think of things like, these are traumatic events. So the data does show that children and young people who have been exposed to a disaster are more likely to seek mental health support. So conditions like anxiety, depression, problem sleeping, PTSD. There is a statistical difference in those children and young people who have been exposed relative to their peers. And there's a range of costs associated with that, which are essentially the treatment and support costs. So people are seeking treatment and the costs in providing those. So that's a significant element. The largest element in the report is then on a further longer term dimension, the disruption that the disaster can have to learning and education. So again, the data shows that children and young people who have been exposed to a disaster, it's likely to affect their learning. So you have a lesser rate of year 12 completion, you have lower academic results compared to their peers and adjusted for socioeconomic circumstance. And that affects children at the time, but then it can also have a lifelong effect, because we know that on average, people who are less likely, who don't complete year 12, are likely to have lower labour force participation, lower lifetime earnings. So you're kind of setting up a differential then where people are on a different path to the one they would have been in if the disaster hadn't been there. And so that amounts to the biggest difference. As to who bears, it's a mixture of the individual and government. Government is bearing a lot of the upfront costs. So generally, we are as a society pretty good at emergency management, at providing supports. Government plays a role. But then the costs over time, and particularly the lack of earnings that can be attributed to or that can be linked to lower education completion, are more borne by the individual. So overall, it's the individual or about 55% of the cost, and particularly for those that occur over time.
Thanks, David. Just want to delve into the long-term implications of some of the costs that you have just outlined, particularly in lost learning and lost potential earnings. So Katie, can you tell us a bit more about what those costs mean from a policy perspective and perhaps from a productivity perspective or lost productivity perspective?
Sure, thank you, Nish. That's right, as David kind of explained, and what we see in the report is that the biggest cost is to the disruption to education. And I think what's really important to understand is that it might not just be from one disaster and your school might be closed for a couple of days or a couple of weeks. What we are seeing is that with more frequent disasters, those that are more severe as well, is that there are multiple interruptions to schooling for children and young people, and that can have really long-lasting implications. So, as David said, there is a greater risk of children not completing year 12, and what we kind of see in the report and also hear anecdotally is that children who are exposed to disasters, and after a prolonged interruption, they might start having school refusal, not wanting to go back. That obviously contributes to not completing year 12. There are kids who might be in school, but they might be very traumatised, as David said, around their experience of a disaster, and so not concentrating in class, and then they might drop out altogether. So disasters, we are seeing that they are having these huge impacts on children's education and learning. It then impacts whether or not they seek higher education, what career they might choose. And as David said, the report really shows that these cause impacts in lost lifetime earnings. And it's not just to the children and young people and their families, but also to Australia. These children are our future leaders, our future workforce, our future parents. And if their education is being disrupted on such a massive scale, we're going to see this bore out in Australia's kind of productivity and economic security. There's a lot of talk about productivity at the moment from the Australian government, and I think we need more attention on future threats that are coming down the line, not just future. These disasters are already here, but we need to consider children in that context and think about those implications for productivity in the long term. And I think when we think about children in this context, it needs to be through a preventative lens. We saw this morning we're spending huge amounts of money on recovery. We need to spend more on building resilience, on being prepared and taking a preventative lens. And this stuff for children is not a new concept, right? We know that governments invest heavily in the early years, investing in universal early learning, in child safeguarding and protection. We know that if children experience a shock during childhood, that they're going to need extra support. So this is not a new equation. So we really need to think about how we continue children's learning, how we continue their access to play and also access to employment for younger people so that we can safeguard their future, but also Australia's productivity.
Thanks, Katie. Rosalind, over to you. A strong focus of your work has been on transformational nature-based, community and nature-based solutions to disasters. How could some of these solutions assist in strengthening the services and infrastructure that children and young people rely on?
Just before I answer that question, I'd like to turn to a previous speaker who mentioned Gen Zs. I've got 2 Gen Zs in my family, and I have to say that when I was that age, I don't think I'd ever experienced anything like a disaster. And my 2 Gen Zs, I'll start with one who was about 4 years old in the 2003 Canberra bushfires, found her hiding under the bed with a teddy bear, terrified. So, yeah, sorry, was very emotional. We had to evacuate. And then they experienced the bushfires in 2019-20, affected their health, and have since experienced COVID, which was a massive disaster and really has affected those kids. So my whole goal is to try work out how we can actually stop these disasters happening in the first place, at least reduce their impact. And what I'm seeing is that the traditional approaches that we have to disasters just aren't working, and they're not keeping up with climate change. So we need to expect the worst, and we need to do something different from what we've done in the past. We need to find new solutions. So the research that we've been focused on here is to find those new solutions. How can we stop those catastrophic bushfires happening like we had in 2019-20? And we now have a Bushfire Research Centre of Excellence at ANU that we've worked really hard to build up. How can we use nature-based solutions to both improve the environment and to reduce the impacts of flooding? We even have some research here on how we can intervene in cyclones to reduce their intensity. And of course, if we can reduce their intensity and their impact, then we're reducing those disastrous results that we have for our children that we've been talking about today. And to achieve this, we can only do so much here at ANU. We need massive, rapid innovation at scale in Australia and around the world, and we're not seeing it happen. We need large collaborative research missions to make these solutions happen in time to avert the impacts of intensifying extreme events. So we need to recognise the scale of the threat and respond accordingly, and it's happening too slow.
Thank you, Rosalind. Thank you also for sharing that out. disasters that affected your family, I think a reminder that this is also real for all of us, and from the perspective of an international development organization, a reminder that these phenomena know no boundaries. I mean, we're used to working in developing country contexts, in small island developing states, but this is happening to everywhere, to all of us. I want to ask each of you now about, I guess, distinct but interrelated pieces of the solutions puzzle. And first to you, David, on data. The report notes in a couple of places that these cost estimates are conservative, and this is largely due to limited data available. So can you tell us a little bit more about what types of data we're missing, what's below the iceberg, if this is the tip of the iceberg, and how we can fill some of these data gaps in our national systems?
Thanks, Nish. I think we've got a fair chunk of the iceberg, but perhaps not quite everything. So what we have done is we've used a great data source, the longitudinal survey of Australian children, which allows us to track the experience of kids after they've been impacted by a disaster and have a view on their health and education outcomes. So that's great, and we've supplemented it with other sources where we can, but there are still limitations. So for example, talking about injuries, so we know about medical presentations at the time of the event, but then what about injuries that are a consequence of the disaster? So exposure to, pardon me, to bushfire smoke, and so health consequences that might come over time is not something that we've been able to include. Mental health effects, we're actually only able to cost that for the first 2 years after a disaster. So we're kind of lacking a picture as to how long-lived those might be. So there are certainly still gaps. We are, fortunately in this country, we live in a country where evidence is important in policy making, and so collecting that evidence and getting better evidence is a worthwhile ambition. So to the extent that we can get an age flag within more data sets, particularly given we know that the circumstances, the developmental circumstances of children and young people facing disasters is places them in a different position to the adult population. So understanding that will be important. More longitudinal data and being able to link data sets, so understanding the disaster impact and then linking that with other provision of services is important too. So these are all things that we can kind of advocate for and get, hopefully down the track, even better evidence to help support that policy change.
Thanks, David. Over to you, Katie. We've advocated, this is UNICEF Australia, for a while now for a national framework for children and young people dedicated or focused on disaster recovery and resilience. What would this look like, and how would it assist not only in reducing some of these costs, but protecting children and young people going forward?
Thanks, Nish. I think before we get into the what of the National Disaster Framework, it's really about the why. And, children are not just small adults. They experience disasters in a really different way. And I think, Rosalind, your point to your child in the bushfires, they have a different experience. And we really need policymakers, decision makers to understand that distinct difference for children, that they're having a different experience and therefore they need a different response. So children are uniquely vulnerable to the impacts of disasters due to their developmental stage, also their physiology, but also because these impacts will be with them for longer throughout their entire life. And so we need to start thinking about these in a different way and respond accordingly. I think at the moment, what we're seeing when a disaster kind of hits a community, people naturally focus on repair and recovery. But unfortunately, that means that the needs of children and young people are inadvertently overlooked. And we know that there's a lot of different needs. The report shows, we've spoken about the cost of education and lost lifetime earnings, but there's also a lot of costs and impacts around mental health, around displacement, around child abuse, around young people losing casual employment. And so we really need to think about all of these different impacts on children and young people and what we can do about it. And that is why UNICEF Australia has been calling for a national disaster framework for children and young people. Currently, each state and territory kind of has their own plan, and they deliver things kind of in a different way. We really think that we need a nationally consistent approach to this so that we can get the right systems and supports in place to ensure that children are supported not just during a disaster, but before, to build that resilience during a disaster, and most importantly, in that recovery phase. And as David said, disasters have a really long tail. We see particularly a lot of mental health symptoms don't show up immediately, and so we need those right systems and supports in place so that children and their families can have the right services to be able to respond to disasters in the long term. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Katie. And finally, funding, which is always the big elephant in the room. Rosalind, you've previously called for a national innovation fund for disaster solutions. Tell us a bit more about the fund, but how we might embed funding for child and youth specific solutions in such a fund.
Sure. So someone said earlier that disasters aren't in the future, or they are in the future, but they're here now. Whereas one likes to think that defending our country from foreign invaders is far away in the future. But it's kind of interesting to think that the government's spending $3.4 billion over 10 years to have established an advanced strategic capabilities accelerator to deliver capabilities needed by Australian Defence to connect and streamline defence innovation, science and technology. And we have nothing like that for disasters. The Defence Science and Technology Group annual budget is nearly $500 million. They have 22,000 scientists, engineers, IT specialists and technicians. We don't have anything like that to defend Australia from intensifying natural hazards, to deliver the new technology, strategies and capabilities that we need. We have a sprinkling of research funding, $85 million over 10 years with the Natural Hazards Research Australia Centre. It's nothing compared to what we have for defence. So I think we do not have the balance right. I'm not saying we shouldn't be defending our country from foreign invaders, but we should be defending our country from disasters which are ever present and increasing. What I'm finding with youth, and I think we could really work with this, with our disaster solutions research here, is there's a lot of enthusiasm from our Gen Z students, as Hannah would call them, in ANU, to come and work with us to help us research these disaster solutions. And they tell us that it makes them feel much better about their climate anxiety, which seems to be an ever-present issue for our youth. Another suggestion that I think is worth thinking about, although not all youth might be that keen on it, is a suggestion from Don Blaxland, who's an ANU academic here, is to have a youth national service in disaster preparation and emergency response. And this would both create a new workforce of young people to contribute to those ever-growing costs of preparing and responding to disasters. But to my mind, it would also familiarise our young people with what needs to be done to protect them and to prevent disasters from having that impact that they're going to have and now having already. And it would really skill them up into what's going to be needed for their future. So that's another way that we could spend those funds. Thank you.
Well, we've got about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. We might start online, Lena, if there are any, and if there are questions from the room, please raise your hands.
This is a question that has followed us actually through the whole day, but I think it will be relevant to the panelists to make a comment on. The question is around genuine consultation, and in particular with the advanced of Gen AI and AI-driven news development, the nice way of putting it maybe, and disinformation campaigns more broadly, how citizens, governments, organizations, I suppose, might consider that genuine consultation and how to advance and support it in the context of technological advances and the positive impacts of that, while making sure that we're considering engagement and intersectionality as we think about support.
That is a big question. I might speak to a part of that, which I guess is kind of what David said, is that you know, we are lucky and fortunate that we live in a country where our governments listen to evidence, and that evidence includes obviously what's been in the report through the available data, but a lot of the work that we do at UNICEF Australia is through that genuine consultation with children and young people. We engage them on a range of different topics, and we really like to get them in front of decision makers through many different kind of mechanisms to ensure that their voices are heard and that they have a seat at the table when it comes to the issues that affect their lives. So I think we still have those kind of mechanisms and opportunities available to us. I take the point that we are kind of up against AI and technology kind of moving forward. But again, I would say I think children are our best asset. They are technologically savvy. They are ahead of the game when it comes to that stuff. And so I think they can, the more consultation we do with them, the more they can teach us about that space as well and how we combat things like mis and disinformation.
And Katie, I mean, UNICEF plays a great role. We had Lincoln before, and you have your ambassadors. So, I mean, that is hearing from people genuinely. I mean, I think you're kind of striking, or the question kind of strikes on a theme that's in this area, but a lot of areas of society, younger people feel disenfranchised or not involved, and maybe that just goes to a lot of the broader policy settings that we have. I mean, we when we look at other issues, be it tax, housing, there's always a kind of undercurrent of, well, if you look at this from a generational lens, it actually doesn't seem fair, and it's the game is rigged against younger people. So there are, I think there's those sort of undercurrent of genuine issues that come up, and it's feeling disenfranchised that's maybe then leads to kind of withdrawal. So I think being open and maybe very proactive to seek different views is actually going to be necessary to change not only the consultation, but then actually start to change some of the policies.
Yeah, it brings to mind conspiracy theories are really a huge problem today, and social media and AI have a lot to support in that respect. I'm not sure of the way out of them, but I've been on TV quite a lot explaining that cloud seeding isn't causing the floods and storms that we are seeing across the world at the moment. Well, at least not man-made, deliberate cloud seeding. It's more, putting those greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere is intensifying rainfall essentially and causing these floods and storms. And how we address that is really worrying, because in fact, the research we've been doing on stopping cyclones is all about putting aerosols into cyclones in a very targeted way to actually stop the intensity of cyclones. And I just want you all to stop and think for a minute. If Cyclone Alfred had been a Category 5 cyclone that hit Brisbane and the Gold Coast, the destruction that we would have seen if we had the chance to do something about that now, we should be. And so conspiracy theories can really intervene with that, interrupt any kind of progress. And we're just seeing it now in the US, full scale with the changing government. I think it's a real problem. On the other hand, I think, as Katie said, our young people understand this stuff better than anyone. My 21-year-old laughs at me all the time when I fall for all these AI images and videos on social media. I think if we can engage our young people in how to address these these social media and AI problems that we have probably go a long way. So, but I think it's really a problem.
Okay. Do we have any questions from the room? Up the front, Louisa.
Thanks so much to Lincoln and the panelists for such a rich conversation. So one of the recommendations of the report and the policy brief is that the need for place-based risk assessments and strategies. Could you explain a bit more why this is necessary and what it's like?
Thank you. Yeah, so the report is really clear around if you live in if you're a child or young person living in a rural or remote area, you are more at risk of a disaster. You're also more at risk of the impacts of disasters if you are a First Nations child or young person, and also if you're already kind of experiencing disadvantage and vulnerability. And we know that disadvantage and vulnerability take kind of a place-based lens when you look at Australian communities. And so these are the communities that are unfortunately going to be hardest hit by disasters. And so I think not only do we need, as I said before, kind of a nationally consistent approach to how we respond, but we also really need to focus in on these communities that are going to be hardest hit because of a range of different reasons, and think about what place-based solutions look like for them, but also not just kind of the top-down approach, but working with those communities, working with young people about what's going to work for them in their community. Anyone else?
What we found just on with the nature-based solution to play is it's absolutely essential to take a place-based approach to the risk assessment of floods, and then a place-based approach to how you might address it, and that would apply to children and others and everyone who lives in those areas. You can't just have a blanket approach.
Great. Well, we're at time, so thank you to all of the panelists, and thank you to ICEDS and the Institute for Water Futures for hosting this launch today. And I'll now hand over to Professor Llewellyn Hughes, the Interim Director of ICEDS, to close. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Some really tough conversations about the challenges that we're going to face, and particularly young people are going to face moving forward. The first thing I guess to say is that at ICEDS, that's the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, that we're really proud to be able to elevate this conversation and these conversations, and also these voices which are helping us to understand the challenges which have been described, but also to think about how we might adapt and manage those challenges. I think also as I was listening and reflecting today, the discussions that we've heard really show the ANU and the university sector and the research sector broadly really at its best. You can see that the work which is being done here is based on deep research. It is very technically capable, but it's also highly engaged, both with the community together and also with different communities as well. And as we've heard from the last panel, a crucial community is the youth. And I've got a couple of, I guess they're Gen Zs. I don't know, maybe they're millennials. I need to figure that out myself. And it's also engaged with organizations which are operating within the community as well. So it's really important for me to thank UNICEF Australia for partnering with us in the work that has been done here. Also with NEMA, there was some work that was mentioned a little while ago about nature-based solutions, as well as the Institute for Water Futures here at the ANU in helping to deliver the work that has been done here. Today's discussions have been recorded, and so they'll be made available. I think it's on YouTube, certainly via the ICED's website. You've heard a couple of different documents which have been released today. Most importantly, the document which was just referred to in the previous panel. And that's also available to you to download. So I really encourage you to engage with that material and to share that material with other audiences, not only here, but really around Australia, because as you've heard, it's highly relevant to communities from really across our country, not just here in the ACT and in Canberra, although obviously very important to us here. So yeah, really terrific to be able to have the honor of closing things out, to elevate the voices and the discussions that we've heard here. We need more of it, more money as well, as Rosalind pointed out. And I welcome you all to continue the conversation over lunch. There's some lunch back where we were a moment ago, and look forward to speaking with you all again. Thanks so much for coming.